Hands are moving. That's all I see.
So here we go. Fred Harburg is on the line with me here, and we are doing a continuous series of interviews and talking and discussing about something that both he and I are passionate about, and something that he has a heck of a lot more experience and expertise in, and that's growing people and developing people through coaching specifically. And Fred Harburg, formerly the executive director of the Executive Development Program at Kellogg School of Management, that's Northwestern's graduate school in management and leadership. He is now a clinical professor, so gets to do the same stuff and gets to investigate really, really interesting topics. He's working on a book right now on judgment and decision-making in the executive level. I'm excited to hear more about that in the future. But today, Fred and I wanted to talk about this idea behind what to focus on, whether it's about strengths or weaknesses. And I'll let Fred get into a little bit more about the language that he introduced 2 interviews ago. About the part of it is from Kurt Lewin and some of the foundations of helping people grow and what to focus on, and also what he's been learning recently as he's been working with current and future C-suite executives. So Fred, welcome again to our discussion. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, John. I'll back up a little bit, because after our conversation a couple of weeks ago, you said that people were very interested in hearing more about the idea which I introduced as Kurt Lewin's. And I want to explain where that came from. So way back when, in the dark ages, when I was studying psychology, I was introduced to Lewin and his idea of force field analysis, and it was a big idea. I didn't realize how big it was, and it was sort of reinforced how big the idea was when I heard Daniel Kahneman speak a few weeks ago. And of course, Daniel Kahneman is the Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist, famous for his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a book I recommend to everyone. I read it in 2013, and I still say it was the most important book I read in 2013, and maybe this decade. It's a remarkable book. It's not easy reading, it's thick, and it's worth the effort. I really recommend it. But he was being interviewed about how people make change, and he said, well, you know, I think the basis of how people make change was developed by Kurt Lewin, and he had the biggest idea I ever heard in psychology. And that, of course, caught my attention. When a Nobel Prize winner says, a Nobel Prize winning psychologist, he is a psychologist by training and degree, says this is the biggest idea in psychology I ever heard, and he referred to this thing that I had studied years and years ago that caught my attention, but I didn't have perhaps the insight or acumen that Kahneman does to see that this is huge. And I always thought it was very powerful, but he said the most important idea he ever heard in psychology. And that was, of course, Kurt Lewin's idea that we operate, human beings, when they're trying to make change, when they're trying to grow and improve, they do that in a field of forces. And so this is an idea that Richard Beckhard at UCLA championed, which was, if you think about the future state that people desire to be in, let's say they desire to lose weight, and you think about the current state where they say I'm 30 pounds overweight, and then there's a path forward of things that they need to do between that current state and the desired future state of losing 30 pounds. And what Lewin added to this sort of simple model, which I've used a lot, I mean, I use that model virtually every time I go to work with an executive team. I get them to think about what is it you like and where are you, and then let's try to map out the path forward. What Lewin added to that was that path forward exists within a field of forces. And the field of forces are all over the place, but they're essentially like vectors. And some are directly behind you, and that is they're leading right toward what it is that you want to have. And others are directly headwinds. They're right in the opposing your progress. So if we go back to losing weight, everyone knows the basic physics of this. At least they should know the basic physics, which maybe are a little counterintuitive, and that is 1 pound of human body fat weighs 3,000 or has 3,500 kilocalories in it. What we call a calorie is a nutritionist or a food scientist would call a kilocalorie. And so 3,500 calories in 1 pound of human body fat. And so to lose 1 pound of body fat, you would have to burn 3,500 calories. Well, it turns out that the human animal burns calories by doing work, and that work is mass over distance, as we know from physics. And that mass over distance, it requires actually that a human being move under their own power about, they burn about 100 calories when they move a mile. That is, run or walk. And it doesn't matter, run or walk. This is a really interesting thing about physics. People say, nah, you're telling me if I run for 30 minutes, I burn the same number of calories if I walk for 30 minutes? And the answer is no, of course not. You burn many more calories if you would run for 30 minutes versus walking for 30 minutes. The issue is distance, mass over distance. If you walk a mile or run a mile, you burn virtually the same number of calories. And that's been debated and replicated many, many times. So to burn a pound of fat, 3,500 calories, it's clear. All you have to do is walk or run 35 miles. That's all. And
That's
eat,
all.
yeah, and eat at normal base metabolic rate, which for most human beings is around 2,000 calories a day, plus or minus, depending on your genetics and your age and your weight and your conditioning and all the rest. But it's plus or minus 2,000 calories during a day. You'd have to eat at that, no more, no less than you normally would. Run 35 miles and you'd lose 1 pound of body fat. Well, that's a tough go. I mean, and furthermore, if you wanted to lose 10 pounds, all you have to do is run for 55 continuous hours at 9-minute miles, and you would lose 10 pounds. Well, gosh, so the key to losing weight for any human being is to exercise control in terms of portions and eat at a slight deficit. And your body will actually take care of losing the weight. So, you burn huge number of calories through the day and while sleeping. And if you just consume a little less, you do that. That's hard for most human beings to do because if most human beings are like me, they really like to eat. Now, what all this has to do, if we go back to the field of forces, so if you wanted to lose weight, you wanted to lose 10 pounds, really clear, you have to eat at a deficit every day so that you're burning more calories than you're consuming. That means controlling portions. And that's problematic, and it's problematic because of the field of forces. One of the driving forces that we have, in fact, a force that drives us like fight or flight for survival, is to consume food. When we get hungry, we love to consume food. It's very hard to say, nah, I'd like more food, but that's enough. I'm going to stop at a deficit of what I'd really like to consume. I'm going to stop when I'm not when I'm full, but I'm going to stop when I'm satisfied, or at least minimally satisfied, and I'll lose weight, which will. So the underlying desire is this desire that is associated with eating called pleasure. And so if I tell you all you have to do is eat less, it flies right in the face of a force that impedes your progress, which that force says, eat as much as you can, as fast as you can, every time you can. That's the force. And furthermore, underneath that is a desire for pleasure. And so when I tell people, exercise discretion, exercise discipline, eat less, then there's this huge force pushing them the opposite direction, to say no, eat as much as you can for the pleasure of eating. I really enjoy eating. That's a tough thing. That's really a tough thing to fly in the face of. And so what Kahneman says, what Lewin said before Kahneman, is you have to find a way to reduce the restraining forces. And so the analogy I like to use is like you have your foot on, you're in the car, you have your foot on the brake, and you start adding gas. And you just add more gas and more gas and more gas, and all you do is burn the engine up. You have to get your foot off the brake, removing restraining forces somehow. So the restraining force, then finding in a change that you want to make, in growing, learning, increasing a skill, whatever it is, you have to figure out what the restraining forces are. And Lewin's research shows that it's 9 times more effective to reduce a restraining force than simply add more driving force. I really want to lose weight. I'm gonna lose weight. I'm gonna put up pictures of myself in a swimming suit or whatever. That removing the restraining force is much more powerful. And so this goes to something that other authors, I love Switch. I love Chip and Dan Heath in Switch, and they talk about the elephant and the rider and the path. And they talk about the rider as being the rider of the elephant being our emotions, the rider being our rational control, but the path is the environment and shaping the path. So to finish this long-winded explanation about eating and so forth, what you could do to shape the path is change the environment to make it easier to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing. And so you could change the restraining force, reduce the restraining force by moving all the candy, and you could take all of the simple carbohydrates, the bread and the pasta and so forth, and you could put it out in the shed, way out in the back of the property, and you could put the vegetables, and you could put the lean protein and the healthy fats, like avocados and things. You could put those right on your desk to make it extreme. And what you've done is you've dramatically increased the effort required to do the wrong thing. You've made it much easier to do the right thing. You've shaped, in Chip and Dan Heath's words, you've shaped the path, and you've done what Lewin says, is you've reduced the restraining forces, making it easier to make the right choice to choose food you want. So,
yeah, and I want to tap into your engineering perspective. As a pilot, you probably had to do force field analysis.
Absolutely.
And
we did weight and balance before we took the plane off. If the plane was too heavy, based on the ambient temperature and the altitude at which we were taking the plane off and the length of the runway, if we didn't reduce the restraining forces by lowering the cargo load, we couldn't get the plane off the runway.
But if you didn't have any engines, it really wouldn't matter.
Exactly.
If you didn't have any thrust at all, if there wasn't any drive forward, then restraining forces don't really matter. And what I wanted to get at is that you have to, I think one of the things that that force field analysis in psychology, you have to look at all the forces and understand all the contributing forces in order to decide not only just whether it's restraining or driving forces, but they're coming at all lots of different vectors. So which is going, deciding which ones are really going to make the difference, even amongst all the different restraining forces.
You make a great point, because if you think of the other forces, besides those over which you have direct control, there are a lot that you don't control. You don't control the ambient temperature. You don't control the humidity. You don't control the elevation. You don't control, on and on. Yeah. And the winds, the prevailing winds. If the winds are tailwinds and you're trying to take off this, you got to have a longer runway. And so I think you make a wonderful point, being really astute And in fact-based coaching, we talk about framing. And when we're framing, good framing is good detective work to understand the field of forces that this is playing with. Who are the people that are with us? Who are the people that are opposing us? What are their interests? Why are the people who are opposing us trying to oppose this project? What are the cost considerations? How much time do we have to do this? What is good enough and what is better than we need that would sabotage this? And on and on and on. The clearer the thinking, the better the thinking in this about all the forces that play in the framing, the more likely this is going to be a successful effort.
Yeah, I remember I was introduced to the fact-based coaching model before I did a deep dive into emotional intelligence. And right. I found Richard Boyatzis' research, and his I mean, it sounds directly out of Lewin, and it sounds like you guys were all reading the same books. And this idea of first picking a goal, picking an outcome that you desire. What does success look like? Defining success first, and then taking a look at your current state, ideal state, real state, but then asking yourself, as you are honestly talking about those two different places and the dissonance, the tension that's created by seeing you're not where you want to be, the next step being, let's take a look at the entire field of forces, or let's look at the things that are going to help you, things that are going to be hurdles for you, and just talking through all those pieces before you create a plan. When I think about it, to me, coming from an outdoor background, it's, choosing a destination and knowing your current location is great. But until you look at a topo map and the weather report, you really don't know what course to take. You want to look at all those. Hey, here's a valley we can go through, but if it's raining, it's going to flood. We don't want to go there if the weather report dictates. So looking at that entire map as you create your, in this case, some sort of a change strategy or a learning plan or whatever you want to call it, looking at that entire map in order to close the distance between where you want to be and where you are right now.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you started that by talking about a compelling reason for doing this. And when in the framing, in a coaching conversation, when we're working with somebody who desires to make the change, the question is, how much do they desire? And how committed are they to obtaining that? And how clear are they on what success would be, on what it is they desire? And if all of those are weak or ambiguous, it's unlikely that they're going to make the change. One of my favorite stories is from my beautiful and wonderful wife, Susie. And when I was a young pilot in the Air Force, she worked in public health, and it was kind of tough. I mean, when I would land from a mission, I'd be home for a few days, and I'd often go over to visit her at the public health clinic where she was a pediatric nurse clinician. And I remember going over one day, just sitting and reading and doing some of my work over in the corner. She had a patient come in, and the patient was to get a shot, I think, hypodermic needle, and Susie's preparing the needle, and the little child looked at that needle, eyes got great big, and ran over to the corner and huddled, and the mother came and said, "Oh, come on, you got to get this shot. It's really important for you." And the little girl turned to her and said, "Mama, I can't want to." And I think that, the person that you're coaching has to want to, and they have to be clear on what it is that they want to have or to do or to be. That's that vital step in the framing of identifying what would success be, and why is that important to you, and what would be different if you had that success, and what difference would it make to others as well in the situation. If that is not present, then, and I think this goes to your point that, yeah, Lewin may be right about restraining forces, but there's this driving force, which is the sense of purpose or mission or goal or success. And if that's weak, ill-defined, not strong and present, then change is unlikely.
Yeah, I used to do a lot of time management workshops. And I mean, really, this is true for any workshop that I would do. I would have a caveat of, this is not going to work unless you want to. And so the very first bullet point was always, first, you got to want to.
Yeah.
And if it's not compelling enough, you're not going to change. And what I really enjoy about all these things came together in my world at about the same time: fact-based coaching and Boyatzis' approach to change and emotional intelligence. This idea of it has to be intrinsic motivation. Yeah. Even Pink's Motivation 2.0 or whatever, when he defines it as a movement from an external motivator to an internal motivator, that's going to make all the difference in the world. And I would get frustrated with a lot of the training that we did, because all it would do was give you an external checklist of what to do.
Right.
And the problem is that got people functional fast, but once they got functional, they couldn't bypass that. Their internal motivation was to complete the checklist, not to gain competency. Right. And so they applied it and they worked it and they got to that, and then they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to improve after that. And even when you do an assessment beforehand and you figure out what parts of the checklist you don't need to hit, that still just gets you functional a little bit faster, but it doesn't help that person create a growth mindset. It doesn't create an intrinsic motivation to continue to grow. Whereas when you identify what you want to become first, and whether it's technical training, you can still ask, what kind of professional do you want to become? What kind of technician do you want to become? What kind of reputation do you want to have? Those questions set people up to go beyond whatever checklist it's available to you. So that intrinsic motivation to continue to grow. Now, I know pilots live in a world of checklists, but why is it different for a pilot and a checklist than it is for basic training and a checklist?
Oh, you read my mind. I mean, as you asked that question, I was thinking about that exactly. So I would never demean a checklist. I think good surgeons have good checklists. I think good nuclear engineers who are running a reactor have a checklist. We just saw this fiasco in Hawaii where the missile alert took the entire island by storm and terrified a lot of people because the person didn't use a good checklist to say, is this real? Did I verify it? Am I operating in the real alert system or the practice alert system? And all of those failures to follow procedure almost created a disaster. And failure to follow procedures have caused many disasters in the past. So I'm a great fan of a checklist. I think they're very powerful. However, that said, let me add to it to say there are pilots and there are pilots. And so, I graduated from the Air Force Academy in 1972. A year behind me in 1973 was a pilot named Sullenberger. And he landed a plane on the Hudson. It was not in the checklist. Sullenberger did something that the controllers were telling him not to do. And of course, if you've seen the movie or you read articles about it at this point, you know, had he followed the controllers, he and all of the passengers and crew would be dead because his instincts were right. That's a really interesting topic for another discussion about, this goes back to Kahneman. This is system 1 heuristics, because this was a guy with excellent heuristics. Most people don't have excellent heuristics. So a young pilot would not have the same instincts that he had to do the right thing in that situation. But he had the right instincts. And so when I say there are pilots and there are pilots, I was a good pilot. I'm certainly not a pilot of the quality of excellence that Sullenberger is. And the difference between me and Sullenberger is that I liked flying. I enjoyed it. I was fairly good at it, but I was not passionate about it as a life. I was the kind of pilot who liked to find out who are the passengers in the back and where are we going and What's the geography of this
What's
place?
their story?
Are there museums there? And do I have friends in that location? But great pilots say the machine, the process of using the machine, the flight itself. Each one of these is deeply passionate for them. They love to talk about planes. When we would land from flying, oftentimes we'd go to the officers club, and many of the pilots would want to talk about, there I was and there he was, and the hydraulic system was operating like this. Then I noticed this about, we had flown all day. Now they wanted to talk about it all night. And I was like, I want to go see the city. I want to, and I realized, probably when I grow up, this is not the profession for me, because you want pilots like Sullenberger who just ate and slept and loved to think about flying and doing what they did with passion. So I'm a great fan of a checklist. I think checklists have saved a lot of lives, and I think failure to adhere to checklists have killed a lot of people. But there's something beyond the checklist, which is the passion for understanding and questioning why this checklist. How did we come to this? Why is it important to turn on the de-icing before this step in the procedure and so forth? And what are the consequences if we didn't, and so forth? It's the passion for understanding the science and the art and the music about flying itself that deeply makes the difference.
I think the one thing, I think it is about the passion, but it's also knowing the limits of the checklist itself, of knowing when you've gone off. Like you talked about heuristics and this idea of rules of thumb, which are wonderful when they're applied in the right context, and horrible when you're applying a rule of thumb that doesn't fit the context.
Right.
And you talk about thinking fast and slow. I read that, and it really got me thinking. And then the one that I like, because I'm not as
did it get you thinking fast or slow?
Yes. But because I'm not as smart as you, I found a different book that hit very similar things. It's called Wait, the Art and Science of Delay. And it hits about the same sort of thing, but it really talks about the importance of delay in thinking and the different roles that heuristics versus thinking play. So he talks about, like, even in milliseconds, the difference between a great professional, like tennis player. You think about the great serve returners. And when they did a study, pretty much everybody has the same reaction time, about between 3 and 5/100ths of a second. Whether you're a trained professional or not, that's your reaction time. The difference between the great serve returners and those that weren't were how long they waited before they had to act. And the ones who used the most of that wait time were the ones who were able to make the best decisions, whether it was milliseconds or whether it was days. And he goes over all the different levels.
Who's the author, John, of Wait?
A guy named Frank Portnoy. I'll hold it up again just for kicks. So, yeah. And this, to me, it was very much more accessible and less leaning on statistics than Thinking Fast and Slow. But I think they both fill in a gap of the importance of, like, checklists. There's another great, you're familiar with the Checklist Manifesto. That's a doctor who he basically said doctors are spending too much time making decisions that they don't have to make. So how can you get into the smallest checklist possible so that you get them to care as quickly as possible? And so he wrote this book called the Checklist Manifesto, about encouraging doctors to stop being so prideful about all the contingencies and stop focusing on things that didn't necessarily make a difference most of the time. Go ahead, Fred.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I merely want to say Atul Gawande is amazing. He's also written on Being Mortal, which is about end-of-life considerations. Anybody who's listening, if they have the chance to read anything that Atul Gawande has written, I'm not familiar actually with the Checklist Manifesto, but I'll pick it up. Thanks for the That's it. That's great. I wanted
Well,
to go
it's exactly what you were talking about on why checklists are important.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to your comment about Partnoy and the book Wait. Um, so I love that, and I intend to read that as well. But it reminds me about Walter Mischel. So Walter Mischel, of course, is the eminent psychologist from Stanford who's famous for the marshmallow experiment. And this is a related but slightly different idea of wait, which, his research showed that the capacity to delay gratification, to wait when making a decision about what to do, when making a choice, was hugely predictive about success in a variety of areas. Higher SAT scores of kids who could delay eating the marshmallow by the 15 minutes that he asked them, by over 200 points in terms of SAT scores. And you go, what? Of course, it makes perfect sense, because delaying the gratification to play the next video game or go out and play baseball for me when I'm growing up, or go swimming or hike or whatever, to do the homework, that capacity obviously over time is going to, but I love the connection there of the value of waiting, which to me goes back to the book I'm working on right now, which is on judgment. And what we know is one of the fundamentals of excellent judgment is the capacity to deal with anxiety in the midst of ambiguity, the capacity to wait. I often said to young pilots when we were flying, and I was an instructor pilot later, that I would say, there's an adage, people say, don't just stand there, do something. And I would say, don't just do something, stand there. And that's to the homage to the idea of wait. Wait before you take action, to consider implications and potential consequences of this. So my favorite story about that, and I was just talking to a guy who worked with the Dutch airline KLM, and we were telling the same story to each other. There was an airplane in the U.S. inventory called the C9, which had a high T-tail and 2 engines. It was a 2-engine jet that had engines in the tail. It was we used it for mercy missions. It was a flying hospital. We use it for air evacuation, and many children who were in trouble in the United States, we'd send air evac in to pick them up in a C9 and take them to often a situation like a burn patient, to the burn center in Texas. That's probably the best burn center in the U.S. at Brooks. So the terrible problem with the C9 was that it had these 2 wonderful engines. It was a great plane, but there was a cross-wiring difficulty that sometimes you get a false indication of a fire in an engine, and you'd have 2 controls that were near the throttles called red apples, and the red apple would flash brilliantly, indicating you got a fire in this engine, and the procedure was to pull that red apple, and it would extinguish the fire by putting foam in the engine. But the problem with the C9 was that the Nightingale, which was the name of the airplane, was that you get this false indication. And you could have a fire in the right engine, but you get the red apple blinking in the left, and unless you would wait to verify, if you simply pull that, now you've got one on fire, and you just put the good engine out, and now you're dead. That's a problem.
That's a problem.
You just turned this plane into a brick. So we had this elaborate thing that we would do in training. We would say, pilot or co-pilot, whichever saw the warning the first, we're getting a fire warning. You seeing that? And the co-pilot would say, yes, sir, I'm seeing that we've got a fire warning. He'd say, and it indicates that the right engine is on fire. I said, yes, sir. He said, so the pilot would say, I've got the plane. Look out the right window. Look back there and see if you see flames. And that And he'd say, Roger. And he'd look out the window and he'd say, indeed, that thing is burning. And say, okay, I'm going to give you the airplane. I simply want to verify that the left engine is functioning properly. You got the controls? Roger, shake the stick and he'd take the controls. You look out, left engine seems to be working fine. Okay, so let's put our hands, you put your hand over mine on the red apple for the right engine. Do I have the right engine? Roger, sir, you got the right engine. We're now going to pull it together. And we'd pull it back and say, okay, verify that the foam in the engine, the fire's out, and he would, and give him back control, and I'd verify the engine, and then we'd make the call to get emergency landing at the closest air. So that's the kind of elaborate nature, and this goes right to your notion of wait. Don't just do something, stand there. Good judgment requires that people take enough time, not too much, enough time to deal with the situation with verifying that they're doing the best possible thing in the situation.
My story on this about waiting and the power of it is as a scuba instructor, one of the first things as I'd take new students into the water, we'd go to the pool, very controlled environment. And first of all, in scuba diving, never ever hold your breath. Mm. But if for some reason your apparatus stops working and you take in a breath of water for some reason, what I would do is without the scuba apparatus on, actually above the water, I'd have them hold their breath. And, you know, how long could they hold their breath? Even the most, unfamiliar person can hold their breath for 30, 45 seconds.
Sure.
And then afterwards I'd get the watch out and I say, let's just watch how long that is. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, they get this new idea of how much time they have to take care of an issue before it becomes an emergency. Because most divers think as soon as that air is unavailable or as soon as something happens, it's an emergency, rather than having this space for decision making. Yep. And it was amazing the change. Just underwater, you can't really talk, but you get to see people's eyeballs. The first time they experience the regulator out of their mouth, their eyeballs get really big and immediate fear. But as soon as they start to realize the time that they have to make a decision, there's calm decision making that's going on. And when I'm working with leaders and with performers, anybody, helping them get that accurate self-understanding of how much time do they really have before they have to act. Too often what happens is they're very Pavlovian. There's an incoming email or they're given an assignment. And instead of taking all the time they have, they see how quickly they can get it done, mistakes and all.
Absolutely. Well, John, I have loved our conversation. As always, I find these conversations really stimulating and fun, and I hope that viewers find them as well. So we're having a good time no matter what.
Exactly. I hope people start to join the crowd, even on the live version. If I try and send out an announcement a day before or a couple hours before, if you get one of those, join us live and ask us questions, help direct our conversation. Otherwise, it's just up to Fred and I, and we go all over the place. Help direct us to meet your needs. Subscribe so that you get announcements every time we put up one of these live ones. Subscribe to the Growing People podcast channel. Join us, comment, ask us questions, and we'll respond to them. We're going to try and do these each week, or depending on travel, maybe every other week. Whenever we get a chance, I want Fred's insight into how people grow. A couple of topics that came up that are for future this time is like talking about instincts and getting deeper into thinking fast and slow, Kahneman stuff, and Frank Portnoy stuff, and weight. Get a chance, maybe Fred and I, after he gets a chance to read the book, we can discuss weight and all its ramifications for helping people grow. The other one is when Fred's ready to talk about his new book project and the ideas around judgment. Man, I really want to dive into that. So I hope everybody has a great day. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all the things that you need to do to make this social media thing work. And I look forward to hearing from you guys soon. Have a great day.
Great to talk to you, John.
Thanks, Fred.